My name is Bryan Dewsbury. I am originally from the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, and so I came to America back in '99, and now just having a great time teaching and researching science education at University of Rhode Island. Science education is a difficult thing to really classify as a field of study because almost by definition, it is an interdisciplinary exploration process where you bring together basic research principles from education, from sociology, from psychology, from history. And honestly, that's actually one of the reasons I love it, right? Because I get to go down these rabbit holes of a whole bunch of different things. If you're talking about the social context of education, what you're saying is that things that happen outside the classroom, so how people live, how people eat, their economics, their family relationships, their gender identity, all these things come to impact their willingness and desire to engage in what we do inside the classroom. So as an educator, it behooves me to understand those factors. My passion with teaching is being with students and helping students cultivate a sense of meaning and purpose. For a lot of people, when they think about teaching, they think about a subject, they think about a textbook, they think about, the delivery of information. But teaching for me has always been way more than that. When I was a grad student and I had the privilege to teach students for the first time, I was pretty bad. But it was really the relationships I developed with those students who taught me that it was important for me to look into their soul and hear their voice and have what they wanted to get out of this world be the thing that decided what I did in the classroom. From that moment, I knew I couldn't do marine biology as a career. I loved it, but teaching and research on teaching was where everything had to go after that. Our research program really just takes a scholarly approach to that, right? We try to understand what is the social context of teaching and learning, like what goes into that passion, what informs motivation. Education is about the remaking process. It's about a constant sense of interrogation, about asking who you are, what your place in this world is, the ways you can contribute. I want you to leave seeing the world just a little bit differently than the way you saw it when you walked in. So that could be through the things that you learn, or it could be through the people that you interacted with and the hard questions that you had to solve, and not necessarily content questions, but questions about humanity, right? Questions about the common good, questions about improving society, right? So remaking is about interrogation. If you can leave the class and feel that you were part of a remaking process, I would feel like I'm moderately successful.
On behalf of the URI Foundation and Alumni Engagement, I'd like to welcome you to today's program. My name is Karen LaPointe. I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives for Alumni Engagement. Today we have alumni, parents, students, staff, friends, and faculty in our audience. Thank you so much for joining. We are very excited to introduce our new Faculty Office Hour series today. I'm sure you're wondering what you can expect over the next hour. Remember when you were in school and you stopped by your professor's office with a research question, or maybe for some extra help on a concept you missed in class, or just to say hello and talk about your shared love of World Cup soccer? Well, today we get to stop by Professor Bryan Dewsbury's office. We hope you'll enjoy the conversation with Professor Dewsbury, ask questions, and have an opportunity to learn something new. Today's program will be recorded. Following the program, we'll send a link to the recording with a number of recommended resources, just for a little extra credit. We are very pleased to be joined by Dr. Cheryl Foster, Professor of Philosophy, who will be moderating the discussion today. Dr. Foster has won numerous teaching awards and has twice served as Associate Director of the URI Honors Program. Her interdisciplinary research spans art theory, ethics, nature, the public good, and issues surrounding mortality. She has degrees from Bowdoin College, the University of Chicago, and the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, where she studied as a Marshall Scholar. We have no doubt our audience will have questions for Dr. Dewsbury. Please post them at any time in the Q&A box located on your Zoom taskbar at the bottom of your screen. We'll do our very best to get to as many questions as we can. Now, I'd like to turn the program over to Dr. Foster.
Thank you, Karen. Hi, everybody, and welcome to our very first inaugural Faculty Office Hour. In a moment, I'm about to introduce to you one of the stars of the science classroom at URI, my friend, colleague, and mentor, Dr. Bryan Dewsbury. But before we get started, just to reiterate what Karen said, this is not your staid lecture passive situation. This is an office hour. So as you go, if you have questions or topics you want to hear more about, stick them in the Q&A. And our handy dandy team behind the scenes, Leslie Lowenstein and Katie McGuinn, along with Brian Smith running the media, will get everything queued up so we can jump right in and talk to Dr. Dewsbury. So with no further ado, let me introduce the man of the hour, Dr. Bryan Dewsbury. Dr. Dewsbury is an associate professor of biology in the College of Environment and Life Sciences. He holds a bachelor's degree in biology with an environmental sciences minor from Morehouse College, as well as a master's and a Ph.D. in biology from Florida International University. Dr. Dewsbury's research interests include pressing issues such as student retention in STEM fields, the underrepresentation of minority groups in certain STEM fields, and the role of affect domain in student learning gains. He uses the results of this extensive research in developing curricula for his Principles of Biology 101 class here at URI, and our lucky students reap the benefits. It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce the extraordinary Dr. Bryan Dewsbury.
Thank you, Cheryl. Just want to make sure that my screen is shared before we start talking. Hi, well, good afternoon to everyone, and I'm very glad that you chose to spend some of your lunchtime with us. You know, it's interesting. You know, we call this faculty office hours, but one of the things that I try to grill audiences I have the privilege to talk to about equity is that perhaps we should not be calling them office hours. We should call them student hours, because they're actually for students. It's actually for them. And you would be surprised how many students have told me that they thought office hours was the time the professors got to check their email. So they didn't think, they thought it would be a faux pas to go and knock on a professor's door and ask them a question. However, you got the email, you know that it is your time, and I want to spend a little bit of time talking to you about what we think about in the Science Education and Society research program as it pertains to equity. We are a very unique program. We take as a given, as our foundation, that education and anything that is sort of connected to that process really is partly about human interaction, and it's about understanding what goes into that interaction. So we study the social context of teaching and learning. We take a scholarly approach to that. We think about it from a philosophical lens, from a historical lens, from a practical lens. And what invariably happens is we, and myself in particular, get a lot of questions about equity. What are the answers to solving the achievement gap, and how do we get more URM professors into the STEM field, etc. And I think those are fine questions, but sometimes I think we need to take about 10 steps back and maybe ask a different set of questions. Because once you have a situation where only 4% of faculty across the country are people of color, if 35% of your freshmen are leaving STEM after the first year, then that is happening long before people apply to grad school. So we have to look at the systems and the policies that result in these kinds of outcomes before we think about just solving the outcome itself. Equity for us really is about power, not necessarily power in the sense that everybody has equal power, but the power that some people have to define your reality for you. So housing policy predicts where people live. Property taxes is predictive of the kinds of resources that schools have. So when you want to talk about achievement gaps, or what I would prefer to call opportunity gaps, you have to think about the policies and the people who enact those policies. I can't, and it's not my intention here, to explain to you that I will solve 100 years of inequity with intro bio. I would love to, but I can't. I want to discuss with you today, just briefly, about 25 minutes or so, how you take a class that is at least at our university, the first science class that most of my students take at our college. And you think about equity in terms of the human interactions that happen in that space. And I want to be very clear on that because there are two important reasons we take that approach. Number one, when a lot of people hear and think about equity, they will ask, I think the knee-jerk reaction is to ask, well, Bryan, what are 10 things, give us a list of things we can do to make our campus or our classrooms more equitable. This is not a list type problem. This is a journey type problem. This is a problem where you have to explore your policies, you have to do some self-reflection, you have to own up to mistakes, and then you have to craft a plan that is specific to your situation. Because what happens with the list approach is people would like to take the list, enact the list, and I'm like, whew, wow, we dodged a bullet. Everything's good now. We've absolved ourselves of any responsibility going forward. And that's not what it is, because humans are an inexact species. It's a beautiful thing. So I teach intro bio, and every year 150 students walk into my classroom, but there are 150 different students. Every year, they are different, and I'm not going to make assumptions on who they are based on last year's class. So introductory biology for me is more about the intro than the bio. Don't get me wrong. I do care about biology. I love it, all right? I have 3 degrees in it for a reason. But what predicts success in that introductory space, that introductory classroom, goes well beyond what's in a textbook. People's mindsets, people's sense of motivation, the preparation level. So if my teaching is not speaking to those other things, then my class can become a weed-out course. And that's not what this is about. So what I want to do is share 3 things, each with an example, that shape the equity approach that we take in this classroom. Because we see those 3 things as the chief reasons why we're getting the kinds of results that we're getting. And what I want you to note with these 3 things is, when we design curricula, when I design a curriculum for this class, I am not thinking about the end of the semester. I am not even thinking about the next semester. I am not even thinking about their graduation day. I'm thinking about the kinds of citizens I would like to be engaged in this world as they go off. So I have to think about the characters and the qualities that needs formative development, that needs practice, it needs to be exampled. That needs to happen in that classroom. The content is what it is. You put this stuff in context, they'll pick it up, it'll get reinforced over time. But what they will remember are the relationships they've cultivated. So thing number 1, agency. In social science, we think of agency as this ability that you have to make independent decisions. This idea that you cannot be unfairly influenced, you cannot be forced and coerced into decisions that are not your own. And what you have to understand is that the traditional STEM classroom robs students of their agency. It sounds a bit harsh, right? I know. Hear me out. What do people think of when they think of a science classroom? Professor walks in, they have 40 slides, neatly summarized of the content. This content is explained to the people in front of them who are typically much younger. This content gets repeated in an exam format. Quid pro quo, you get a grade at the end of it, and that's the end of the transaction. I want you to engage this because I get how this power dynamic works, right? If Bryan says it in a loud Caribbean voice, right? It must be right. If it's written in a textbook in glossy print and underlined with good pictures, it must be right. I am not saying the textbook is wrong, but I'm saying that's not what knowledge is. So we have a class motto that says, you do not know something until you can explain to your roommate. So what that means is, when I ask questions on exams, I don't actually use multiple choice. I have them write things out. I give questions to which there's actually no real right answer because it's something that is being actively studied. The point here is two things. Number one, you could ABCD me until December and still actually not know what you're doing. So you actually only know if you know it, if you can confidently articulate something and feel some questions on it, right? So I'm building up metacognition in this process. Number two, I'm actually breaking down the barriers between the power structure that you assumed existed in the classroom and trying to show you that it is your responsibility to ask questions. That is how you improve on your knowledge. That is also how you demand the power and space and resources that you need for yourself. So when you have this structure where it's assumed that this person is just reading off of something and what they say is something I can reproduce, what you are in fact doing is setting up a dynamic where future people can adopt the same modality, and thus the subject, and I'll call them subjects in this case, assume that information to be correct. So, a word I like to use, some friends of mine like to use this word, education is about curiosity. We only have 4 years for the most part with students. The best thing we can do is teach them how to ask the right questions, not to try to fit, all the world's knowledge into one space. Because as the world changes, and it changes faster than, we have time to capture in books, that curiosity, that willingness, that agency is what will make them adaptable to new careers, new ways of thinking. Secondly, I want to talk about respect for humanity. This is a particular, I don't want to say pet peeve. Pet peeve sounds harsh, but a number of times, actually, let me give you an example. Many years ago, I was doing a faculty development workshop on equity in education, and it went pretty well. And one of the pieces of feedback we got in an anonymous evaluation was that, yes, Bryan, all this stuff is good, but I teach cell bio, so this doesn't apply to me. See, there's a phrase that comes from Elizabeth Mohay's paper in 1996. It says, I teach students, not subjects. So if your mentality is that you teach subjects, you assume that your years and years and years of very narrow training in a very specific subject area is the only thing that qualifies you to be in a classroom. And that mentality is what has allowed us, mostly in science, to walk into that classroom and assume that our role is to simply wow the audience with the thing that we spent so many years studying. Right? I'm actually not trying to be critical because I think this is a systemic problem, not an individual problem. But if your mentality is you're teaching students, then your concern is the cultivation of the individual. And that demands a very different skill set than being able to run a PCR, than being able to be an expert in one particular species of flower, right? And so part of that cultivation of the individual is respect for humanity, so that in that mindset, you don't outsource social justice and diversity and equity conversations to the MLK breakfast. You don't wait for Hispanic Heritage Month to talk about representation, to talk about equity, right? You don't wait for student affairs or housing to put on events. You understand that within your discipline, people need to see themselves represented. People need to be able to have difficult dialogues with other people. People need to be able to engage in that dialogue in a respectful manner. So while so many classrooms talk about quote unquote group work, we consider group work as an opportunity for dialogue to happen. So let's think about this for a second. If the groups that are formed in the classroom don't have structure, don't have assignments that are carefully thought of, they don't have rules for engagement, you can actually find yourself replicating the inequity that already exists in your classroom. Because your groups are an incredible opportunity for students to learn what it means to do the difficult dialogue. So yes, it is an intro bio class. Yes, we talk about cancer. But as a group, they'll write a group essay on the theft of Henrietta Lacks's cells. Yes, we talk about DNA structure. But as a group, they write an essay, a group essay, a discussion on the theft of Rosalind Franklin's data, the theft of her data that led to the discovery of DNA. And so that means then, if I'm going to expect that kind of dialogue from them, between them, we have to model that. We have to spend time in class to talk about, here's how you have difficult, here's how you have respectful conversation about these topics. Here's what you do when there's a disagreement. Here are the outlets that you have at your disposal should you all not be able to come to any kind of consensus, or should there be some other kind of problem. Here's the mechanism by which you can hold each other accountable for being a full part and a full participant in this assignment. Because that learning outcome is just as important as any other content learning outcome. Third, I'm interested in cultivating what we call critical consciousness. This term means the ways in which the students engage the world around them, with particular attention to inequity, with particular attention to the abuse of power, and the ways in which political structures are used to subserve and demean and maintain inequity. So we have this interesting, what's the word? This interesting kind of mindset in science sometimes, that as if science is a completely apolitical process. As if people who do science don't exist in a social structure that has its own norms. And those norms, you don't have to look too far back, has marginalized so many different groups since the founding, really. So when you look at the many examples, and I'm just listing a few here, of ways in which the scientific enterprise has contributed to incidents of gross inequity, you look back and you kind of scratch your head. And I know the temptation is to say, well, oh, Bryan, that happened many years ago. No, my friends. Look at who died from COVID. Look who's disproportionately represented in those deaths. I'm not saying there's an act of intentionality. I'm saying that science is not divorced from how society runs. So if I am not bringing these things up explicitly in the classroom, I'm actually doing them a disservice, because I wonder, as they go forth, should they choose to become scientists? Should they choose to be asking research questions or becoming medical doctors? I want that engagement with society at large to be at the forefront of their minds. So in order to do that, we have to look back in history, right? We have to look back in history and understand the social context that allowed these kinds of things to happen, lest we make any similar types of mistakes in the future. I the classroom it's to me, it's a microcosm. John Dewey said that education is not preparation for life. Education is life. And I do believe that. And our take on equity, our take on inclusion is really more about bringing humanity as a central component of what it means to be educated in a classroom. And what used to be a 35% failure rate is now 8 to 10%, most times lower. What used to be an assumed outcome gaps between ethnicities doesn't exist. We've cut 45, 50% of the content, and students are still performing at a very, very high level in the upper division courses. So we've made the case, and we'll include some resources on this after the webinar, but we've made the case very clearly that it's not that content does not matter, it's only part of the academic experience. So now as a program, where we are shifting our energy is to think about what this system is doing. I actually believe, and I've really had the privilege to, now I think I've been to probably 65 campuses across North America. Most of the faculty I've met, honestly, most of the faculty I've met, really are on the right side of this in terms of wanting to do something. What we have to focus our energies on are the systems that govern our professional behavior. So honestly, I could do without another Black Lives Matter statement. What I want to see is your tenure policies. What I want to see is your hiring policies. What I want to see is your budget items and what resources you are putting to address inequity in your campus. Because as an institution, you will communicate what you value by what you are incentivized, by what you support. If it continues to just be the MLK breakfast, then you'll get that level of change. You'll get the fringe. You'll get the people who feel good about themselves that a celebration is happening. But you won't get to the core of the issue. I'll stop right there for today. But I do encourage you, we're going to have a fair amount of time to have some additional Q&A. But if you do have questions for me in the future, this is how you find me. And perhaps I tend to be more responsive than I should be, but I will respond because I understand that unlike so many other kinds of topics in academia, this is very much a journey. This is a conversation. And you will have to find what is useful and what is necessary for your classroom context and for your institutional context. But I'll bring back in Dr. Foster, who will bring in some Q&A from the audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Dewsbury. There's so much to talk about here. And I want to invite everybody and remind you to use the Q&A to pose questions, make comments, identify topics you want to hear more about. And speaking of that, Dr. Dewsbury has some recommended terrific resources for further reading and learning if you want to follow up. So we'll be emailing those along with today's presentation to everyone at the Faculty Office Hour today. For now, Bryan, you've given us a really comprehensive and rigorous feel for the research behind and supporting the inclusive classroom as well as the inclusive learning community. Can we, for a second, flip that on its head? Can you bring us into a Bryan Dewsbury classroom at the start of every new Bio 101, right? Can you share with us a boots on the ground technique or two for how do you get to know those new students? You say, every group is different. You can't rely on the past. So bring us in and share some of your secrets about how you get to know each new crop of students in front of you in bio.
Well, first I would tell you it's not really a secret because I've written about it, talked about it around the country. I think the first thing to note, Cheryl, is that getting to know them process begins before I actually physically see them. So, I get my roster usually mid-August or so, and I send 2 assignments, which are crucial. One is, it's basically a survey. It's actually published, I think, Kilpack and Mellon. I'll include it in the resources. And it's a list of, 10 to 12 questions. Simple questions. What grade do you expect to get in this course? What are your preferred pronouns? Name one thing a professor does that annoys you, one thing that you like. Describe one thing that you're really good at. What career do you plan to pursue, right? So I get this sort of semi-quantitative data set, right? Kind of getting to know who they are and what what their strengths are and what they're interested in. Then the second assignment, which I hate to rank things, which you could probably tell by now, but this has to be my favorite assignment, and it's probably the most powerful thing I feel comes out of the classroom experience. I send them the prompt used for the NPR program, This I Believe. Like, I literally copy paste the prompt from the NPR website. There's a link that says guidelines for educators. I copy and paste that exact prompt because it's beautifully worded. It's longish, but what it essentially is asking the respondent to write in 500 words or less, no more than a page. Describe the values that shape your deepest passions. Describe the values that shape your deepest passions. So it's essentially asking the person to reflect on this notion of why, right? And so you might wonder, well, Bryan, it's an intro bio class. Why do you care about that? I'm trying to look into their soul, right? The class is about awakening the soul. So when I read these, and I know initially some people were concerned, well, students would kind of take it not seriously, they write whatever. They do not, right? I have gotten essays about, drug use in the family, children of divorcees, Sunday dinner is the most valuable thing ever. You start to see what matters to people in life, right? And so then what I do is I write my own essay and I read it aloud in class, right? And so we now know each other on a different level. And what's beautiful about these essays, Cheryl, is once you read them, you can't unread them. Mm-hmm. You can't unread them, right? They're no longer URI ID number, 150 kids and everybody gets a grade. No, these are individual stories. And what the essays, a lot of them speak to, there's kind of the very serious things to write about, but then there's also, I'm not really a science person. I was never really good at math. What you're telling me is you haven't had a good experience in science up until this point. So now I know that my teaching has to work on that mindset, because if I can't change that mindset, it doesn't matter how many clickers I use, right? I have to get you to believe, right, and get some task value first before we get into the tricks. So that getting to know you process, that I'll just give you those two for now. That's the crucial beginning, right? That happens, and then the first day of class, a lot of time is spent. Like, there's no syllabus day in this class. There's no go through syllabus. There's setting the tone, right? And we spend a lot of time talking about, I am not a barrier. We have a support structure in place, right? This class is about everybody's success, regardless of where you come from. Today is day one of the rest of your successful life. So we don't drop the rigor, but we increase the support structure so that should people need it, it's always there in whatever format that's necessary.
Well, thank you, Bryan. That is so vivid. Mm-hmm. And of course, one of the things that's vivid about that is how much time it takes to revise the questions you ask back in August, to read all of those, to get a feel for students, and then to actually read through the essays, as well as find resources like This I Believe. And so that speaks to something else you said in your presentation, which is instead of another statement that's designed to make us feel good, let's change the policies that acknowledge the time and expertise investment that goes into mindset support to achieve rigor for everybody. So this is exciting, everybody, because we have questions and observations piling up in the Q&A. So thank you for that, and keep them coming. So let me turn this over now to our colleague and friend, Leslie Lowenstein, who is going to share your questions and observations for Dr. Dewsbury as part of the office hour. So Leslie, on to you.
Thank you. We had one question that was submitted ahead of time. I'm going to ask that one first. Could Dr. Dewsbury speak to the underlying theory or works he pulls from to inform his work about how students cultivate a sense of meaning and purpose?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are a lot, but I will give you a few. I am very much informed by Paulo Freire's work, both Pedagogy for the Oppressed and Pedagogy of Hope. I'm informed by John Dewey's work, Education as a Political Act. Bell Hooks' Teaching to Transgress has greatly informed my approach in the classroom. I mean, those are the three that kind of, bubble up to the surface right now. And believe me, that's plenty. And they kind of run along a similar theme. But if they want more, I can include more in the resources.
Great, thank you. We have a couple of questions having to do with the promotion and tenure system. One person says, it strikes me that the promotion and tenure system is all about subjects, not students. How do we revise the system to truly recognize respect for humanity?
And you have a bottle of kerosene and a match? All right, let me try to be quick about that because it's a good question, but I think perhaps more explosive than maybe the questioner intended. Here's the truth, is we actually don't measure teaching. We really don't. We're trying to. I think it's perhaps better than it used to be, but it hasn't existed in a format I think I've seen that is worthy of the sophistication it deserves. But see, what you have to understand though is not just that we don't measure it, we don't actually even make accommodations for it. Like, so in grad school, you're not trained to teach, you're trained to develop expertise in a very narrow area. And then somehow as a faculty member, you're expected to do all of these other functions in addition to being a subject area expertise, and teaching is just one of them. So that means that the way we hire people is not based on an actual validated determination that teaching has a skill, right? So then what you're seeing in the P&T process, my friends, is just a reflection of the dismissiveness and the kind of subjugation of teaching as a professional act that quite frankly begins at the undergrad level. So, yes, the P&T process needs to be transformed, but everything else in terms of teacher preparation for the college classroom needs to be transformed. So to begin then, you really kind of have to ask yourself, what skills are necessary to be a good teacher in the classroom, right? And I say teaching, not inclusive teaching, because what then happens with inclusive teaching, it becomes a thing, right? Like it's this kind of teaching and that kind of teaching. No. Good teaching is inclusive, period, right? So if that then can get codified in a scholarly way, in a measurable way, right? Now you can start having that, you train future faculty in this method and you hire them, because they've demonstrated this skill. Now you can start having expectations of practitioners to do this in their classrooms. And once you have that expectation, you can have a peer support or a peer observation process. I don't like using the word evaluation because it sounds like a very stick model, but you kind of have a support process where people are getting better and better and better over time, right? And one of the projects I'm working on right now is trying to document in terms of actual classroom practice what good teaching looks like that can then be included in things like collective bargaining agreements, that could be included in P&T documents and things like that. So, there's a lot wrong with P&T. There's a lot of issues with that process. But I would say how teaching is considered probably has to be at the top. But I wouldn't just kind of throw, I wouldn't be kind of reckless to just say, okay, we need to measure teaching now. We have to really do some more work on codifying what that looks like before it ends up in that kind of documentation. That's a good question.
Great, thank you. Next question is about students, and it's specifically referring to group work or group projects. How do you keep the students who are engaged or understand quickly during group projects to keep from having to continually explain to others or end up doing the whole assignment? How do you, or do you control the levels of the groups?
I don't know what the person means by levels. I'm assuming they probably mean in terms of, who might do it faster or whatever. But let me answer the question directly. We actually do a process, I think we do it in the second day of class, that I love. And it comes from a group called the Process-Oriented Guided Inquiry Learning Network. And it's an activity that teaches students about group dynamics. And in this activity, I give them a problem set, and I designate a leader, a reader, a reporter, and I think a writer was the fourth thing. And they have a set of problems to do, like 5 or 6 problems. And at the end of, say, halfway through, I ask the reporter to name 3 things that the group is doing well and 3 things that the group can improve on. And invariably, one of the issues that the reporter brings up is that you have, one person kind of just wants to move on really, really quickly, right? Without kind of checking in to see what everybody else does. So I use that to have a conversation that, okay, this is in fact a group assignment, right? So I know you kind of have a temptation to sort of just get it done, but part of being a leader is to ensure that everyone's on the same page before you take the next step. And we talk about what that process is like. So with that example, Leslie, sometimes there's this kind of mentality that group work is just helpful for kind of the quote unquote weakest students. But no, there are values to be taught, even to people who may be ahead of the game content-wise for whatever reason, right? So you could have gotten an A in this class if it was just straight lecture or whatever, but this is, again, teaching students, not subjects. I'm teaching what it means to work with others and be understanding of that circumstance, right? And we have an explicit conversation about that. All right, and so when they do their group evaluations after every unit, so 4 times a semester, right? There's specific questions on, was the respect there? Was the accountability there? Did we actually work together, right? Versus did one person try to take the whole thing over?
Bryan, can we connect the parts of this discussion a little bit? So if we go back to the idea that folks who make their living in the academy are not, unless we went to a program that really puts resources into the development of pedagogy alongside research. We come into our first jobs. If we're fortunate, we've had some training or experience, but chances are we're thrown into the deep end with our first full schedules on our own or without any much, formal training. Earlier, you said that sometimes when students are in Bio 101, they write to you, I'm not good at math, I'm not good at science. Let's think about these 2 things in tandem. What's it like, especially since so many of our attendees today are not part of the academy, right? What's it like for folks who are faculty to feel that they might not be very good at teaching, right? Or that they have to wing it, or they're not sure that, to what extent does our own insecurity about being comfortable in the classroom help us to avoid these questions that you're talking about? And then the second thing is, can you tell us a little bit about what's happening at URI to make faculty feel secure, supported, and comfortable in creating the culture you envision?
Yeah. Well, the first part of your question, Cheryl, actually connects to the question the person asked earlier about PNT. And it is important that I explain that, because the temptation sometimes is to think of these kinds of questions or these kinds of issues in isolation, and without understanding how they're connected to other things, then you can miss the forest for the trees, right? That issue about how faculty feel in terms of, you get hired and you're not really familiar with these methods yet, et cetera, et cetera. Part of that also speaks to what has been communicated to you by institutions on what we value. People aren't stupid. They know what gets promotion. They understand what is valued at the tenure level, right? And so if you have a mortgage, you have perhaps kids who need to go to college, like, people understand for your economic well-being. If you're going to maintain your standard of living and maintain your occupation, you will organize your professional behavior to match what is being communicated to you as valuable. There is a reason why research professors typically run away from intro classes. It demands a lot of time, right? And so if you reason that, look, if this is going to cut into the thing that will get me promoted, then I will not do that thing. I will keep my office door only slightly open during office hours and hope nobody comes. You will do those things, not necessarily because you're a bad person, but because you are responding to where the economic incentives are, right? So what you do then, if you have the power and privilege, if you're in a part of the system, the academy, where you can look at these policies, you have to look at the policies that help communicate what the institution values. And that connects to the other question about how teaching is measured and how it plays a role in P&T and things like that. Until, again, we can put all the statements out we want, but until it's in that process, right, what you're going to get at the teaching workshops are the people who just really like it, right, and have some enough security that they can just show up, right? And so that has to be that has to be there. Cheryl, can you remind me of the second part of your question? I think it was something about URI.
I mean, I think it'd be really interesting for our guests today who aren't part of the campus community as such. I mean, they might be part of the family in the big sense, but what are we doing at the university to cultivate a sense of teaching security and expertise in ourselves? And, I mean, I love the way you responded to that. I also, though, talk to a lot of colleagues who simply behind closed doors are nervous. It's scary to get up in front of a bunch of 18-year-olds and you're evaluated and, maybe you forgot to take the tags off your clothes and, it's a big dream for your students. I mean, it's scary to put yourself out there again and again and again. So, but some of it may be pragmatic as in, oh, I won't get promoted if I don't focus on this other stuff. And sometimes it might just be our own insecurities for whatever reason. But what are we doing at URI? Can you share with our guests today, what are we doing to address people's capacities as teachers and to buy into the idea that this should be a regulatory value in the worth of our faculty?
Yeah, well, first thing you could consider, buy secondhand clothes because they have no tags, and so that takes care of that. You wouldn't become a meme central. No, your point is a good one, and just I think for the benefit of the audience, I want to connect it to perhaps a broader, more national issue / movement, right? You're right. We've already been hired. We have the jobs, we have the classrooms, and now there is a movement afoot where people like Bryan Dewsbury are going around saying that, we need to be thinking differently about our students. We need to be thinking differently about our craft. And oh, by the way, I know most of you may never have had that conversation before now. So how do you now, in your nth year of employment, kind of start doing that, right? So there's a sense in which, I want to say this in a kind way, but we almost workshopping on the back end, right? We already have the workforce that we are trying to retrain, a word I don't like, but we are trying to change the mindsets, I should say, of people who I think like the job, like students, etc. And that, Cheryl, just by definition, is going to come with some amount of fear, right? When I arrived at URI, we didn't, I think there was one person who was doing teaching and learning things. The office is still not a very big office, but between, given the small staff that we have and the people like yourself, like Jay Fogelman, there's many others who've kind of become branches of that office. I'm seeing conversations happening now that quite frankly were dead on arrival in 2014. Right. And I think, so sometimes people are pessimistic about, faculty are so stubborn. I've seen the opposite. If you're patient and if you kind of respect their humanity and be able to appeal to their better angels, I've been very impressed and just heartened by people's willingness to take on, scary new ways, right? Is it perfect? Absolutely not. But what is happening is as more and more people start dipping their toes in the water and trying one thing, trying another thing. Now, all of a sudden, you get a critical mass, right? And all of a sudden, you go from a couple of people talking about transforming their classes to, you know, a teaching and learning showcase, what, hundreds of people show up and show posters to that. So, you know, without spending all the time today, I mean, I feel like department by department with, you know, where there's sort of a one change maker strategically placed to kind of diffuse their own energy and charisma to others, you know, with evidence and with all of the good practice. We're seeing more and more of that happening just across the campus, and I think that's great.
No, you're right. And I second what you say about our wonderful colleagues, who I will add for everyone out there in audience land, were extraordinarily agile and game to handle the pandemic pivot that we all went through last year. So, well, we have time for one more question. So Leslie, I'll let you cue that up and then and end the session for today. And I'll come back and say goodbye, but one more question or maybe two.
Great, we do have one more. The question is, there are several non-traditional students in my classes. When you have those students, how do you find it shapes the hard conversations in your classroom?
I think it shapes it in a beautiful way. No disrespect to my conventional 18-year-old first-year students, because that's the average age of my class, because they shape it in beautiful ways as well. But the few times I've had the privilege of having non-traditional students, which by the way, becoming less and less non-traditional, I think we're up to what, 45%? I forget the actual number. They bring to their class their own funds of knowledge, the term we use in the field, right? Their own experience, their own, you know, longer trajectory of, you know, how they view the world and how their views got operationalized into careers and choices and votes and families, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, my friend and colleague, Dr. Kian Murray Johnson, you know, kind of studies this for a living. It's almost a better, maybe even bigger opportunity to bring those experiences in, to have those hard conversations. You still have to model it, right? You still have to have the ground rules and the structure and the, you know, how we, you know, how you dialogue with one another. But again, the few times I've had that opportunity, it's been an even more rich conversation because they're bringing so much of their own selves to the experience.
I think we actually might have a little more time. We have a couple of other questions that flew in at the last minute, as is the way with our things. We only have about 5 more minutes, but Leslie, I'll let you sort of try to squeeze in what we can in the time we have.
Okay, let's start with this one. Will you talk more about feedback you have gotten from students due to how differently you teach?
Honestly, I say it with all the humility in the world, the feedback has been great. You know, back in the early 2000s, there were a lot of papers in the science world about student pushback on active learning, on these kinds of practices. We've been fortunate never to have that. And I think part of it is because one thing we've tried to be throughout the entire process is transparent, right? This is not a eat your vegetables because it's good for you type class. This is we are doing this activity and here is why. And here is not only how it's going to benefit you in terms of being a better biologist, here's how it can make you be a better person, right? So none of the affect pieces of what we do in the classroom is assumed. It's explicit and it's discussed, right? And so this is back to the whole teaching students and not subjects thing. So I think because of that, Leslie, we don't really get the pushback, because even if they didn't do well or they didn't get an A or whatever, they understood that they had a fair experience. They understood that they had a respectful experience. And they also understood that the style of the class wasn't focused on an end of semester exam. It was focused on their life, their long-term life. So they will internalize those values long before they see Bryan Dewsbury, right? And I think, you know, I'll end the question on this one. One of the assessments I use is another reflection, because I use a reflection to start and I use one to end. And the closing reflection is, again, one page, no more than 500 words. write a letter to a hypothetical future first-year student. And based on your challenges and successes, advise that person on how best to navigate this class and URI, right? So in those essays, I can see why they don't push back, because they look inward and they talk about their own kind of coming to Jesus, their own finding and search for meaning and purpose, and the mistakes they've made, and how their own resiliency, right? How they're able to make a mistake and learn from that. And I would argue that the humanity of the class is what allows for that to happen. So, great question.
That is a great question. And Leslie, do we have time for one or two more quickly? We have a couple of minutes, so.
I think that we can go for one more question. The question I have is, it goes back a little bit to the evaluation of professors. So this person wonders, could universities lose highly specialized professors if teaching is evaluated? And they want to know whether there should be two systems for evaluation and incentives, and whether teaching method classes should be required as they are in elementary and high school education.
Well, I will answer the second question first. I think that it should be required. Well, okay, let me back up. If in a graduate program, let's say a doctoral program, that is preparing students for different types of careers that are PhD requiring or PhD useful, if some of those students intend on going on to academic life, I would strongly advise that they take a class or two or three in the excellence and the scholarship of teaching and learning, right? So, you know, I'm married to a K-12 teacher. You know, she was an English major. She did Teach for America. She apprentice, you know, in Massachusetts. They still have continuing education classes. Yes, we should have a similar-ish type of structure, right? To the first question about losing a specialized faculty, I don't think you will. I mean, these things, I am not trying to pit teaching and research as polar opposites that need to be in competition with each other, right? You can have very specialized people who, you know, just really good at teaching a 500 level class on frogs, right? Or if sort of their faculty profile is more research heavy because that's either their preference or their skill set, what have you, right? So I'm not arguing against the basic science research side of the campus. I'm saying that the pedagogical side of the campus needs to be uplifted and elevated to the same prominence, right? So, you know, no, I don't think you'll lose your specialized faculty because they will still have a home and still have a niche on the campus. It's just making sure this other niche gets perhaps a bit more respect than it currently does.
What a fabulous way to end our discussion today. You know, this false dichotomy that somehow being great at research and great at teaching are working against each other. I think Dr. Bryan Dewsbury has shown us today why that is in fact a myth, because his own research and insights as well as his inspirational teaching are very much on evidence here. So thank you, colleague and friend, Dr. Bryan Dewsbury, for joining us today in our inaugural Faculty Office Hour. And on behalf of those of us who are in fact the faculty in the office hour, I would really like to thank Leslie Lowenstein for fielding our questions today, our media team, Katie McGuinn and Brian Smith, and especially our fabulous stage manager, Neri Garcia, for making everything pretty smooth here behind the scenes. And most of all, thank you to our fearless leader, Karen LaPointe, for inviting us to come and help launch this new venture, the URI Faculty Office Hour. So thank you, everybody. We hope to see you next month. Karen, back to you.
Cheryl, Brian, thank you so much for being part of this inaugural Faculty Office Hour. This has been great. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. As mentioned earlier, the program has been recorded so that you can go back and check your notes. And we'll also be sending along Dr. Dewsbury's recommendation for further reading. We'll be sending out a brief survey as well, and we would very much welcome your feedback. We look forward to seeing you at the next Faculty Office Hour. So on Wednesday, April 21st, we'll be stopping by the office of Dr. Kunal Mankadia from the College of Engineering to learn about his work with smart textiles and wearable technology. Again, thank you and enjoy your day.